All right, my happy little hackers. This week we are going to be picking up where we left off last week with Apache virtual hosts. And in order to really understand how virtual hosts work and how they kind of apply in the real world of server management, we need to mess around with some domains and actually play with our DNS and our virtual hosts a little bit. So while you guys were finishing your papers last week, the other kind of little mini assignment that I had you do was to find or acquire a domain name. Now, I'm assuming some of you had domain names already. For those of you that didn't, I gave you guys some options on where you could find some and even some options on what you could do if you did not want to buy one. So the primary source I gave you was Namecheap for domains. This is what's called a domain registrar, and they are a company that handles domain registration. So all domains are registered through the ICANN, or the International Committee of Assigned Names and Numbers, and they essentially give permission to specific companies in specific countries to divvy out and sell domain names and register those domain names into this kind of master database. So Namecheap is one that I use. It's relatively inexpensive. They're fairly reliable. They have hosting and email and SSL certificates and all sorts of other stuff that you can explore later. But I primarily use them for my domain name registrations, and I've been using them for well over 10 years now. So we're going to kind of today talk a little bit about domain names and also about DNS and kind of how they work together. And if you remember from previous lectures, DNS stands for Domain Name System. So a registrar like Namecheap handles the registration of names to the domain name system. And all these names do, they allow us to assign a human readable name to what will essentially be an IP address on the back end. And you'll see how that works here in a second. So I'm logged into my Namecheap account right now, as you can see, and we are looking right here at the domains that I own. So I own 28, which is quite a bit. I have a bit of a problem with these. So we are going to use a variant of Ciardo.com to look at, to give some examples of what we're going to do this week. So find the domain name that you've bought and click on it. Now, other registrars are going to be a little bit different, but generally, once we get into the domain name system management section, they will pretty much be the same. So in Namecheap, you need to find the all host records under host management and click it. And this will bring up the DNS host management page. So by default, Namecheap takes control of your DNS for your domain. You can assign other domain name systems for your DNS. So I use a service called Zerigo occasionally for my DNS. This handles some of my corporate DNS and other things. And this is a separate DNS provider. And if you were using a separate DNS provider, you could go down to transfer DNS to Webhost, and you could supply your own domain name servers. In some cases, you may even be running your own domain name servers. We're not going to get into that in this class, but that is also an option. So if you have another domain name system that you want to use, you would enter those DNS servers here. And a lot of times this is going to be, you'll enter more than one, at least two, usually 3 or 4. Just in case one's down, there's always backups that they can use. And typically that pattern is NS1, .ciardo.com, NS2, NS3, etc. So we're not going to worry too much about this right now, but in case you were wondering, that's where you handle it. So for right now, though, Namecheap is going to handle our DNS for us. And usually any registrar you use, they will handle your DNS for you. And they'll give you access to some type of host record where you can change and modify your domains. So Namecheap gives us a modified domain menu where we can edit our host name and our DNS information. So there's 3 important things that we need to pay attention to here. First of all, what domain are we editing? And here's Ciardo.net. So just so we know what's going on here, let's go to Ciardo.net and see what it has up on the screen. So as you can see, this is a kind of a parked domain. Typically when you buy a new domain, the registrar will park it for you, which means they just kind of put up a marketing page and serve ads from it, which is good for them, not necessarily good for us. I should probably have this domain name redirecting somewhere, but for the purposes of this example, it works out well that I have not done that yet. So my laziness is paying off here. So as you can see, right here is this free.parkyourdomain.com, and that is essentially what we're seeing right here. And the other one up here you'll see is www.ciardo.net. So there's a couple important things here. The two primary host records for your domain are going to be this @ and this www here. This @ is where the URL goes when you don't put a www in front of it. The www is where it goes when you do put a www in front of it. So remember we talked about in previous lectures that a domain without a www and a domain with one are actually two completely separate domains. Back in the day, people used to have addresses like, ftp.ciardo.net or other subdomains that would route to different parts of an internal network. Now it's pretty common that just the standard domain name typically points to the web server or the www. Now, some websites work without the www, some work with. Good websites that are being administered properly will redirect you to one or the other. And the reason that this is important is because search engines like Google and Yahoo and Bing will penalize you for having duplicate content. So if you have the same content at www.ciardo.net and at ciardo.net and you don't redirect them, the search engines are going to assume that you have two of the same exact sites set up and you're trying to maybe juice the system, and they'll penalize you for that. So you either need to handle this redirect at the DNS level or at the server level, and it's easy enough to do it at the DNS level. So pick which one you want. If you want www to always show up in front of your domain, then you're going to want to redirect it to the @. If you don't want www to show up, you'll have to redirect it the other way around. So if you'll see here, the URL redirect is set up on the @. So anytime you type just www.ciardo.net, it forwards you to the www. And you can see that here, that if I were to type ciardo.net without the www, it's going to do a URL redirect to www, which then takes us down to this host record, and then it takes me to this free.parkyourdomain. So we don't really want that. We're going to leave the www intact. I prefer without it, although in recent months and years, especially with services like Heroku, which we'll get into in a little bit, I've been finding the need to use the www. My personal domain, ciardo.com, which doesn't really have anything on it, does redirect without the www because I like the shorter URL. So the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out what IP address we need to use to point to. And if you have a server set up already, which you should, or maybe you don't, make sure you get one set up with just the basic Apache. And this can be based on last week's lecture where we went into Apache and set up some virtual hosts. So let's find our IP address. Okay, so we're logged into our Rackspace server here, and I'm just going to pull my IP address from that real quick. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter that IP address in the field that says IP address URL. And instead of this CNAME alias, we're going to change this to an A record or an address record. So now when someone types www.ciardo.net, it will point them to the URL of my web server. And again, when someone types it without the www, it will redirect them to the URL with the www, which will then point us to the IP address. So both of those records are going to take us to the right place. Now, that's our primary domain. The next thing we need to do is set up a subdomain so we can test our virtual hosts. And you can set up as many of these as you want. I'll set up 2 here, but you really only need to set up 1 plus your primary domain up here to test to see if everything works. So we'll do sub1, and then in this IP address URL, we need to copy our IP address again, and we need to make an A record. We'll do a sub2 as well, just in case. And again, we need to make an A record. Now, there are other records in here which we're not going to get into right now, but the other ones you'll primarily use are CNAME records, and we'll get into that when we play with Heroku and some other hosting services. We'll actually end up using a CNAME record for our Heroku hosting, and some other hosting also uses CNAMEs, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I've put some notes down below on the different record types for DNS if you're interested in checking those out. Okay, so all we have to do now is save this. And there we go. We have all that saved. Now, the cool thing is if you wanted to, say you had a bunch of different servers, you could actually put subdomains on different servers if you wanted to. So if you had a mail server, for instance, you might want to do mail.ciardo.net and stick it at a different IP address. That's up to you. Other thing to note here is that you don't need to put the full domain. You don't need to do this. It knows what you're talking about when you just put sub1 and sub2, just like that. Okay, so make sure that's saved. We'll save it again. And you should be good to go. And this is basic DNS setup. As long as your name servers are with your registrar, you shouldn't really have to do much more than this in terms of interacting with the DNS system. If you are using a separate DNS provider, the interface will be very much the same. You'll have subdomain settings, you'll have primary host name settings, and you'll have these same record types that you see here. You may have some additional options. More advanced DNS providers do give you a little bit more flexibility, but for the basic stuff we're doing in this class, this is all you really need to be concerned about. Another thing you might see is if you're hosting your own email, there'll be some very specific MX records set up in here for email. We're not going to get into those right now, but hosting an email server is probably a complete other class. This is web server, so we're only going to be concentrating on the web part of that. So this can take a little bit to propagate. This could actually take up to 24 hours to propagate because Namecheap has to then go write these up to the primary and master DNS servers that control the web. So that can sometimes take a few minutes. That can sometimes take a few days. Usually it doesn't take any more than an hour. If you've done this and you still can't get your domains to work properly or they're still not pointing at the right address, in the next video, I'll give you guys a few tricks that you can use to kind of fake it until the DNS has completely propagated. I'll also show you how you can test to see whether the propagation has occurred.